Stop right there, and do not take a single step closer to that door." The furious voice of Michael Adams boomed across the grand marble foyer of his luxurious Seattle estate, echoing like thunder trapped within walls of polished glass and expensive stone. Chloe Miller froze instantly in her tracks by the massive oak entrance, clutching a heavy plastic bag in each of her pale hands, her knuckles turning white from the immense pressure. She did not turn around immediately, but instead closed her eyes for a brief moment, took a deep breath to steady her racing heart, and slowly turned to face the formidable man descending the spiral staircase. "Drop those bags onto the floor." This very instant he commanded his tall figure, casting a long, intimidating shadow across the warm evening light that spilled through the towering windows. "I have been watching your movements for several weeks now, and every single night you leave my property carrying something heavy. Tonight, I will finally uncover exactly what you are stealing from my home." The tense confrontation quickly drew the attention of the mansion staff, who nervously peeked out from the dining room, the spacious kitchen, and the long hallway leading to the indoor gardens. The head chef stood motionless, wiping his flour-covered hands on his white apron, while the senior butler paused his endless polishing of the silver tea sets. Robert the gardener, who had just stepped inside holding his sharp pruning shears, stopped completely still in the middle of the corridor, his eyes wide with surprise. Nothing awakens a quiet, heavily disciplined household faster than the harsh accusation of a thief hanging thick in the silent air. Chloe did not offer an immediate defense, merely lowering her gaze to the flawless marble floor beneath her worn shoes, pressing her lips together as she felt the heavy stares of her co-workers hitting her. "You are not deaf," Michael insisted, raising his voice as he closed the distance between them. "I am telling you to open those bags right here in front of everyone, or I will call the authorities and ensure you become a person with a permanent criminal record." Chloe felt her hands tremble slightly, though it was not out of fear of the police, but rather from a profound exhaustion that settles into the soul when one has been unfairly judged far too many times. Even under the harsh threat of the law, she maintained her tight grip on the handles of her heavy cargo, refusing to let them drop. "Mr. Adams," she finally spoke, her voice carrying a strange, profound calmness that seemed entirely out of place in such a tense situation. "I swear to you on everything that is sacred in this world that there is absolutely nothing in these bags that holds any value to you. Not a single silver spoon, not a stray coin, nothing that belongs to your wealthy life. That is for me to decide." He cut her off sharply, pointing a rigid finger at the gleaming floor. "Open them immediately." The silence in the grand entryway grew incredibly dense as the chef covered his mouth, and Robert took a half step forward, wanting to intervene, but a warning glare from the millionaire forced him back. Realizing that nobody in this massive estate was brave enough to come to her defense, Chloe walked slowly toward the antique wooden table near the entrance, the very place where she arranged fresh flowers every morning. She placed the two worn bags on the polished wood with extraordinary care, treating them as if they contained something fragile and living that might shatter upon impact. Slowly, and without rushing under his intense gaze, she untied the handles of the first bag, while Michael leaned in closely, fully expecting to uncover stolen diamond watches or antique silver pieces. What he actually saw inside the bag left the ruthless hotel magnate completely speechless and deeply confused. Inside lay discarded bread from 2 days ago, leftover dinner scraps carefully wrapped in wax paper, fruit peels separated neatly into a smaller pouch, and a half-empty jar of yogurt that had been sitting untouched. These were merely scraps, the sad remnants of daily abundance that would inevitably end up in the stainless steel trash bins of a gigantic kitchen meant to feed a man who rarely had an appetite. "What is the meaning of this?" he murmured, his thick brows furrowing in deep confusion, as he used his fingertips to poke through the stale crusts, half expecting to find stolen jewels buried beneath the waste. "This is garbage. You are literally stealing my garbage." "Food," Sir Chloe corrected him in a low, unwavering tone. "Food that your household was going to throw away into the dumpster without a second thought." Without waiting for another command, she opened the second bag, revealing an assortment of old cleaning rags, a few empty glass medicine bottles, a half-burned candle, a sliver of used soap, and discarded fabric scraps. All of this was destined for the city dump, she stated clearly, looking directly at the gathered items. "I am simply collecting it before the garbage trucks arrive tomorrow morning." A low murmur of disbelief rippled through the grand foyer as the chef slowly lowered his hand from his face. The butler uncomfortably shifted his gaze to the ceiling, and Robert the gardener whispered to a maid that he always knew Chloe was an honest woman. But Michael Adams was not listening to the whispers of his staff. Instead, a strange, unexplainable tension tightened his chest, because, while it was true that no crime had been committed, the relief he expected to feel was absent. In its place grew a sharp, uncomfortable question that dug deeper into his mind with every passing second of awkward silence. But why, he finally asked, his voice losing its previous judicial authority and shifting into the tone of a man who suddenly realized he understood nothing about reality. Why on earth would anyone want stale breadfruit skins and half-burned candles? What does a person possibly do with another person's discarded waste? Chloe lifted her chin, and for the very first time in the 3 years she had served in his immaculate Seattle home, she looked the powerful millionaire directly in his eyes. There was no anger in her gaze, nor was there any fear, only a chilling serenity that seemed to strip away his wealth and status in an instant. "That, Mr. Adams, is a concept you will never be able to wrap your head around because you have never known what it means to experience true, agonizing hunger in your entire life." The entire foyer collectively held its breath as she continued speaking with a firm voice, even as her chin quivered slightly. "You can search me every single night, you can rip these bags to pieces, but you will never find what you are looking for, because what I take from this house is utterly worthless to a man like you, yet it means absolutely everything to me." Michael stood completely mute, opening his mouth to speak, and closing it again, experiencing a rare moment of powerlessness for a man who managed a massive chain of luxury hotels across the country. Suddenly, he found himself entirely unable to formulate a single sentence while standing in front of his maid and her 2 bags of kitchen scraps. Chloe carefully tied the bags shut with the same reverence as before, lifted them off the antique table, and tucked a stray lock of hair behind her ear. "May I leave now, sir?" she asked quietly, breaking the heavy silence that had fallen over the room. "It is getting quite late, and they are waiting for me." "They are waiting for you," he repeated almost mindlessly, the words tasting strange on his tongue as he tried to process her statement. "Who exactly is waiting for you out there in the dark?" She offered no reply, giving a tiny, polite nod of her head before turning her back and walking out the heavy doors into the fading light of the evening. Her steady, dignified footsteps echoed softly down the stone pathway of the manicured front lawn, moving further away as the sun dipped behind the tall evergreen trees, painting the Seattle sky the color of a fresh bruise. Michael remained rooted to the spot in his grand foyer, surrounded by his silent staff and priceless art, feeling profoundly small for the first time in his adult life. Sir Robert dared to speak, stepping cautiously into the center of the room. "Would you like me to lock the gates for the evening?" Michael did not answer the old gardener right away. His eyes remained locked on the heavy oak door through which his maid had disappeared into the dusk. As he finally lowered his gaze back to the antique console table, he noticed a small folded piece of paper that had slipped out of Chloe's bag and fallen completely unnoticed to the floor. He leaned down and picked it up, unfolding the worn paper with slow, hesitant fingers, completely unaware that his predictable life was about to shift entirely off its axis. It was a crude child's drawing created with a dull crayon depicting a crooked house, a bright yellow sun with jagged rays, and several stick figures of varying sizes, holding hands in a line. In the bottom corner, written in the shaky, uneven handwriting of a very young child, was a single sentence that made the millionaire's heart completely stop beating. It read, "For the lady who brings the food of the angels." Michael felt the solid marble floor sway beneath his expensive leather shoes as he whispered the words aloud, wondering what kind of child would write such a thing about discarded kitchen waste. He looked toward the front door, down at the innocent drawing, and back to the door again, as a burning curiosity ignited in his chest. "Where exactly does this woman take the scraps from my kitchen every night?" he thought to himself. "And who on the other side of this massive city refers to my garbage as the food of the angels?" He dropped the folded drawing into his suit pocket, grabbed the keys to his luxury car from a silver dish on the table, and walked briskly toward the garage. "Mr. Adams, where are you going at this hour?" Robert asked with wide, bewildered eyes, clearly shocked by his employer's sudden departure. "Lock the house up yourself," Michael tossed back over his shoulder, walking with a sudden frantic urgency that he did not even recognize within himself. "There is something I absolutely must find out tonight, and it cannot wait until morning." Outside in the distance, Chloe's small silhouette was already fading into the long shadows of the wealthy neighborhood, heading toward the nearest bus stop. She had no idea that the formidable owner of the mansion was pulling his sleek, dark car out of the gates to quietly follow her through the winding suburban streets. She had no idea that on this particular night, her most closely guarded secret, the one she carried in 2 heavy bags, as if they were made of solid gold, was about to be dragged out into the open. Nor did she realize that this impending discovery would utterly shatter the wealthiest man in the city, bringing him to his knees in the middle of a dirty street. The powerful engine of Michael's luxury sedan purred softly in the gathering darkness as he trailed her from half a block away, keeping his headlights turned off to avoid drawing attention to himself. Up ahead, illuminated by the sickly yellow glow of a flickering street lamp, Chloe stood waiting at the public transit shelter, her precious bags resting faithfully at her feet. Michael had never done anything remotely like this in his entire privileged existence. A man who employed private drivers, flew exclusively in first class, and dictated terms from velvet chairs, was now hunched over a leather steering wheel. He was spying on his maid like a common investigator, yet the burning sensation of the child's drawing resting in his jacket pocket made it entirely impossible for him to turn the car around. Food of the angels. The profound words spun around in his head like a haunting melody that absolutely refused to fade into silence. A loud, rusted city bus screeched to a halt at the shelter, its doors wheezing open as Chloe picked up her heavy bags, climbed the steps carefully, and paid her fare with coins she counted out one by one. Michael let 2 other cars pass him before pulling into the traffic lane, trailing the large bus from a safe distance, his heart hammering against his ribs. The journey across the sprawling city of Seattle was incredibly long, taking them far away from the broad, perfectly illuminated avenues and manicured parks of his exclusive waterfront neighborhood. The flawless landscaping, towering glass facades, and decorative street lamps slowly dissolved into the rearview mirror, replaced by rough, uneven asphalt and sparse, broken streetlights. Elegant residential buildings surrendered to cramped, decaying apartment blocks. Brick walls stained with creeping dampness from the constant rain, and narrow alleys where stray dogs slept on the sidewalks. Michael frowned deeply as he gripped the steering wheel. He had lived in this city for many years, but had never once ventured into these neglected, impoverished corners. His entire reality had been viewed from the very top, from penthouse balconies and executive suites, and he had never possessed a single reason to come down to the ground until tonight. The rusted city bus shuddered to a halt multiple times along the dark route, but at one specific corner Michael slammed on his brakes and stared out his windshield in utter disbelief. Chloe had stepped off the bus, but not to enter a home or a building. Instead, she walked toward a boarded-up storefront, where an elderly homeless man sat huddled on the freezing concrete. People walked past the shivering man without casting a single glance in his direction, treating him as though he were merely an invisible crack in the dirty brick wall. Michael watched intently as Chloe knelt down beside the stranger, untied one of her heavy bags, and pulled out a fresh piece of fruit and the remaining half of the artisan bread she had scavenged. She placed the food directly into the old man's cracked, freezing hands, speaking softly to him in the dim light of the street. "Eat slowly," Henry Michael heard her say, having rolled down his car window to catch the sound of her voice drifting through the cold evening air. "I will try to bring you more tomorrow, if heaven allows it." The elderly man looked up at her with eyes that seemed on the verge of shattering into a million pieces, unable to formulate the words to say, "Thank you," merely nodding his head as he clutched the stale bread. Michael sat paralyzed behind the wheel of his expensive car, entirely unable to comprehend the magnitude of what he was witnessing in the shadows of the city. This exhausted maid, who had absolutely nothing of her own and carried kitchen waste for miles, was freely giving away a portion of her scavenged treasure to someone who had even less. "Who exactly are you?" he whispered into the empty interior of his luxury vehicle, feeling a tight, painful knot forming in his throat as he watched the selfless exchange. What kind of human being possesses a heart capable of doing something like that in the dark, without demanding praise from anyone? He watched Chloe board the very next bus that arrived, and fueled by an unfamiliar, profound emotional stirring, he shifted his car into gear and continued his pursuit. The new route dragged them even deeper into the underbelly of the city, where paved streets surrendered entirely to dirt and gravel, and homes were constructed from unpainted cinder blocks and rusted tin roofing. Michael felt incredibly exposed, aware that his pristine, shining automobile stood out in this desolate landscape like a sparkling diamond dropped into a muddy puddle. A few men standing by a burning trash barrel turned their heads to stare at his vehicle with open suspicion, while a group of teenagers sitting on a broken concrete wall tracked his slow progress with narrowed eyes. For the very first time in his sheltered life, the most powerful man in the corporate district felt entirely out of place, incredibly vulnerable and intensely observed by the world around him. When the rattling bus finally reached the end of the line, stopping at a rusted metal signpost, lacking a bench or a shelter, Chloe stepped off into the gloom. Michael quickly parked his car in the deepest shadows of an abandoned lot, hesitating for a moment, knowing that if he continued driving, the noise of his engine would surely give him away. Making a decision that defied every instinct of his privileged upbringing, he turned off the ignition, opened his door, and stepped out into the freezing night air on foot. With his custom-made Italian leather shoes sinking instantly into the damp, garbage-strewn mud, and his heart pounding fiercely against his ribcage, he began trailing her through the darkness. He kept his distance, slipping behind cracked wooden utility poles, crumbling brick walls, and rusted chain-link fences to remain entirely unseen by anyone in the neighborhood. Up ahead, Chloe walked with a completely different posture than the submissive maid he knew. Here she moved with confident grace, navigating the treacherous paths as if she were a queen. "Good evening, Miss Chloe," shouted a woman who was hanging wet laundry on a line, illuminated by a single kerosene lantern on a small, decaying porch. "Good evening to you," Chloe replied warmly, asking if the woman's little boy had recovered from his severe winter cough that had troubled him the previous week. A small barefoot child ran out from a narrow alley to hug her legs, and she affectionately ruffled his hair with a genuine tenderness that Michael had never once witnessed in his mansion. She was a fundamentally different person in this place. The quiet, reserved woman from the wealthy suburbs had vanished, replaced by someone whose face radiated a warmth that lit up the bleak alleyway. In this forgotten corner of the world where society dictated she had zero value, Chloe Miller was deeply important, desperately needed, and eagerly awaited by everyone. Michael paused behind a thick cinder-block wall, his breathing ragged and shallow, watching her interact with the community as a deep, acidic wave of shame crawled up his throat. "In my grand house, I treated her like a common criminal," he thought to himself, staring down at his mud-covered shoes. Yet in this terrible place, they welcome her as though she were a walking miracle. He watched her turn down an exceptionally narrow dirt path, bordered by crooked wooden fences and cramped, leaning shacks, and he followed with deliberate care, placing his feet softly. A potent mixture of smells enveloped him as he crept forward, a blend of burning firewood, cheap cooking oil, and damp earth, a scent that violently squeezed his heart. It was a fragrance that felt inexplicably familiar to him, stirring ancient memories buried deep within his subconscious, though he could not fathom why it felt like a ghost from his past. At the very end of the muddy path, Chloe came to a halt in front of a structure that was significantly larger than the surrounding shacks in the neighborhood. It was an old, dilapidated building patched together with materials scavenged from a dozen different places: cinder blocks, splintered wood planks, corrugated metal sheets, and thick plastic tarps. Through the numerous cracks and gaps in the uneven walls, a faint, trembling light cast by dozens of small candles spilled out into the dark alley. However, light was not the only thing escaping the fragile sanctuary. The joyful, chaotic sound of many tiny voices drifted into the cold night air, cutting through the silence. "Miss Chloe is here," a tiny voice shrieked from inside the building, instantly triggering a massive chorus of rapid miniature footsteps, pure laughter, and ecstatic shouting. She brought the bags, she brought the food, the children cheered their innocent voices, completely overwhelming the bleak reality of their impoverished surroundings. Michael stood frozen mere yards from the rusted gate, hiding behind a pile of discarded lumber, his mind racing to comprehend exactly how many children could possibly be inside the structure. There were not just one or two voices, there were dozens of them, filling the miserable alleyway with a profound sense of joy that sharply contrasted with the crushing poverty. Holding his breath, he crept forward and pressed his eye against a wide crack between two crooked cinder blocks, and the sight that greeted him instantly knocked the wind out of his lungs. Inside the drafty makeshift house, illuminated entirely by cheap candles resting on overturned wooden fruit crates, sat a large group of children of varying ages, resting on the packed dirt floor. Some were toddlers, barely able to walk, while others were older, yet every single one of them was heartbreakingly thin, staring at the doorway with bright, hungry eyes full of expectation. From among the group, a teenage girl stood up quickly to greet Chloe and help her carry the heavy bags inside, holding a small toddler on her hip with natural ease. "Megan, please help me distribute everything tonight," Chloe instructed softly, as the ecstatic children formed a tight circle around her legs. their faces glowing in the candlelight. We have some bread, a few pieces of fruit, and I managed to bring a little bit of yogurt specifically for little Tommy, because his body needs the extra strength to heal. "Did you hear that, Tommy? They brought your special yogurt," one of the older boys shouted, causing the entire room to erupt into a fit of joyful giggles that filled the space. Outside in the dark, Michael felt his knees go completely weak, forcing him to lean heavily against the freezing cinder-block wall to prevent himself from collapsing into the mud. His heart was hammering so violently against his chest that it caused a physical ache as the crushing weight of reality finally washed over him like a freezing tidal wave. This is not just a struggling family, he realized. With mounting horror, this is an entire orphanage running completely off the grid without any official support. And she is single-handedly feeding all of them with the garbage from my kitchen, the very scraps I ordered to be thrown away every single night, without a second thought. The stale bread he deemed unfit for his dining table. The discarded fruit peels the leftover crumbs. The tiny fragments of his immense wasted abundance were literally keeping these abandoned children alive. This discarded waste truly was the food of the angels for these starving kids, a literal lifeline woven from the excess of a world that had completely forgotten they existed. Michael clamped his expensive leather glove over his mouth to muffle a sob. His eyes, which had remained dry through business failures for decades, suddenly burned with overwhelming intensity. Through the crack in a broken wall in a slum whose name he did not even know, the richest man in the city felt the first hot tear he had shed in 40 years roll down his cheek. Just as he tried to compose himself, a fragile, trembling voice called out from the very back of the dim room, an old woman's voice that carried the heavy weight of a century. "Chloe, my sweet daughter, you have finally returned." The voice rasped softly through the shadows, drawing the attention of the older children in the room. "Come here, please. I desperately need to speak with you tonight, because I had another vivid dream about him while I was sleeping this afternoon. I dreamed again about the little boy with the sad eyes, the one I lost so many years ago when the wealthy people came to our door." Michael stopped breathing entirely, his body paralyzed in the darkness, as something buried deep beneath layers of wealth and arrogance violently snapped awake inside his soul. The old woman's fragile voice lingered in the damp air, pinning Michael to the ground as the words bounced around inside his chest, causing an inexplicable searing pain. "The boy with the sad eyes, the one I lost." He pressed his face closer to the cold, rough concrete, desperately scanning the deepest shadows of the impossible house to find the source of the voice. There, resting on a rickety wooden cot, covered by a quilt made of mismatched fabric squares, lay a very old woman, her hands folded peacefully over her chest. Her eyes were wide open, yet they tracked absolutely nothing. They were pale, cloudy eyes that had stopped seeing the light of the world many decades ago. Chloe immediately dropped to her knees beside the fragile cot, gently taking the old woman's wrinkled hand between her own and kissing her knuckles with a profound reverence. "I am right here," Teresa Chloe whispered soothingly, leaning close to the woman's ear so she could hear over the joyful noise of the children eating. "I have returned safely. The food has been passed out, and all the children are finally eating their dinner, so you do not need to worry any more tonight. May heaven endlessly bless you, my child," the blind woman replied weakly, squeezing Chloe's fingers with whatever meager strength remained in her tired, aching bones. "I honestly do not know what would become of these innocent creatures without your sacrifice, and I certainly do not know what would become of a useless old woman like me." Michael listened from the shadows, utterly captivated by the profound peace radiating from the blind woman's face, a serenity he had never once encountered among his elite business partners. "Did you dream about him again tonight?" Chloe asked gently, pulling the patched quilt higher around the old woman's frail shoulders to ward off the harsh winter chill. "I did." Teresa sighed heavily, a single glistening tear escaping her cloudy eye and tracking down the deep valleys of her weathered, ancient face. "I raised that beautiful boy as if he were my very own flesh and blood. I fed him when there was no food left for anyone else, and I sang to him whenever the dark night made him cry. Then one terrible day, they came and took him away from me, carrying him off to a distant place where they promised he would have a much better life than I could offer. I was nothing but a poor caretaker to them, and wealthy people never bother to ask the caretaker if it shatters her soul to have a child ripped forcefully from her loving arms. So many decades have passed since that day, and yet I still lie awake, wondering if my boy is alive, if he is truly happy, and if he ever remembers the old woman who loved him." Michael felt the cold air shatter in his lungs, the tragic words hitting his chest like a barrage of heavy stones that threatened to crush his spirit entirely. "The boy I lost, the one I sang to when he was nobody." The words echoed relentlessly, a deeply buried fragment of his identity entombed under 40 years of corporate success and profound loneliness began to claw its way to the surface of his conscious mind. "This is just a sick, delirious old woman rambling in the dark," he told himself fiercely, wiping his wet face with his sleeve and trying to regain his logical composure. "Her stories have absolutely nothing to do with me or my life." Forcing himself to look away from the cot, he scanned the rest of the dimly lit room, fully comprehending the massive scale of the humanitarian effort unfolding. There were not just a few orphans. There were dozens of them scattered across the dirt floor, sitting on wooden crates and torn blankets, eating the scavenged scraps in absolute silence. They meticulously broke the stale bread into tiny equal portions to ensure every single mouth had something to chew, sharing their meager rations with heartbreaking fairness. Megan, the teenage girl he had seen earlier, moved gracefully from child to child, acting as a mother, an older sister, and a nurse all at once. "Megan, please make sure the youngest ones get the largest pieces of bread," Chloe instructed, as she stood up from the old woman's bedside to help serve. "You and I can endure the hunger, but these little ones are still trying to grow their bones." "I understand, Miss Chloe," the teenage girl replied with a maturity that proved her dedication, displaying a level of selfless devotion that no salary in the corporate world could ever purchase. Michael observed without blinking, finally understanding that this decaying shack invisible on any city map was a vital sanctuary built on pure willpower to catch the children society had thrown away. These were the sons and daughters of nobody homeless toddlers who had lost everything, existing entirely on the stubborn, relentless love of a maid who scrubbed floors by day. It was then that his eyes landed on a secluded corner where a very small boy sat wrapped in an oversized adult sweater, remaining completely still and breathing rapidly. He was not eating with the frantic energy of the others, occasionally pressing his tiny hand against his chest as if something inside was causing him terrible physical pain. "Tommy, my sweet boy, do you not want to eat your special yogurt?" Chloe asked softly, kneeling in the dirt beside him and brushing his tangled hair back. "I brought this entirely for you to help make your heart strong again so you can play outside." The little boy looked up with massive, exhausted eyes, clutching the unopened jar to his chest. "If I eat all of this by myself, there will not be enough for the others to taste it," he whispered weakly, offering the jar back. "We can just share it." "Miss Chloe!" The silence that followed his innocent words was heavy and profound, carrying the weight of 1,000,000 broken hearts as a sick orphan offered his only food to his friends. Chloe tightly closed her eyes for a moment, fighting a losing battle to contain her overwhelming sorrow, while Michael, standing outside in the freezing mud, felt his icy exterior shatter into dust. A severely ill child, struggling merely to pull air into his damaged lungs, was willingly offering to surrender his only source of nutrition rather than eat while his friends watched. It was the most profound, devastating lesson in human generosity the wealthy hotel magnate had ever witnessed, delivered by an orphan who owned absolutely nothing in the world. "No, my brave little angel," Chloe replied with a severely choked voice, wrapping her arms carefully around his fragile body and pressing a kiss to his forehead. "Tonight, this jar belongs entirely to you, because you must take care of that incredibly brave heart beating inside your chest. So please eat it, just for me." The little boy nodded obediently and began to eat with slow, deliberate movements, offering a weak, trembling smile that caused Chloe to quickly wipe a tear from her cheek before anyone could see. Michael leaned his back against the rough cinder-block wall, completely devastated, no longer the proud, arrogant executive who had stood in a marble foyer demanding blind obedience from his staff. He was a broken man, weeping silently in the dark shadows of a forgotten Seattle slum, confronting a brutal reality that was actively tearing his soul apart piece by piece. The tragedy deepened as he continued to eavesdrop, realizing from the quiet conversations inside that this fragile sanctuary was teetering on the edge of total collapse. The structural walls were so heavily damaged that the upcoming winter storms would likely bring the roof crashing down, and there were no funds left to purchase even basic candles. "We will endure this," Michael heard Chloe say fiercely as she collected the wax paper wrappers from the children. "We will survive just like we always have. And as long as I have 2 legs to walk across this city and 2 hands to work, these children will never starve. I will keep bringing food, even if I have to beg for it, even if I have to carry it for miles, and even if the entire world decides to brand me a common thief." That final sentence violently pierced Michael's chest like a burning spear, a direct echo of the vicious insult he had hurled at her in front of his entire staff just hours earlier. He had humiliated her for salvaging the very same trash that was currently keeping dozens of abandoned children alive, and the guilt burned his skin like pure acid. Overcome with immense remorse, he desperately wanted to burst through the door, fall to his knees, and scream for forgiveness. But his lifelong habit of maintaining absolute control kept his feet glued to the mud. In that moment of agonizing hesitation, his expensive leather shoe accidentally brushed against an empty tin can, resting near the wall, sending it clattering loudly down the quiet alley like a gunshot. Instantly, all movement inside the shack ceased. The children froze. Megan jumped up to shield the toddlers with her body, and Teresa turned her blind eyes directly toward the wall. Chloe, the old woman, spoke with an eerie, supernatural calm. "Is there someone standing outside in the dark watching us? I am so sorry, but I can feel someone standing out there. I will go check immediately." Teresa Chloe responded, grabbing a thick candle and marching bravely toward the rusted metal door to confront the unseen intruder. Michael wanted to turn and sprint back to the safety of his luxury car, to flee to his glass penthouse and pretend this entire night was merely a bad dream. But his legs completely refused to obey his commands. He remained paralyzed against the cold cinder blocks, his heart hammering wildly as the rusty hinges of the gate shrieked open. The flickering yellow light of Chloe's candle hit his face, and she gasped, the candle trembling violently in her grip as her eyes widened in absolute shock and terror. Because the man standing in the freezing mud of her neighborhood, spying on the most sacred secret of her entire existence, was the very last person she ever expected to see in this impoverished place. "Mr. Adams," she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of her disbelief, "you actually followed me all the way out here to the edge of the city." From the deep shadows of the back room, the blind woman's fragile voice drifted out again, carrying a strange, urgent tremor, as if she could sense the massive shift in the universe. "Who is standing out there?" "My daughter, who has come to our door." In the middle of the night, the candle wax dripped onto Chloe's knuckles as she stared at the millionaire, her demeanor transforming from shock into the fierce anger of a deeply wounded protector whose family was threatened. "You called me a thief in front of my peers today," she hissed bitterly. "And now you come creeping through the mud to spy on the only pure thing in my tragic life. What exactly do you want from us, Mr. Adams?" she demanded, her voice rising with protective fury that echoed against the damp brick walls. "Was stripping away my dignity in your grand mansion not enough for your ego? Did you come here to take this miserable shelter away from us too?" "No," Michael stammered, and for the first time in decades his voice cracked and faltered, entirely stripped of the commanding authority he wielded in corporate boardrooms. "I did not come here to take anything away from you. I came because I was confused. But now that I have seen the truth, I do not even know how to look you in the eye." Chloe simply stared at him in tense silence, while behind her the terrified children huddled closer together, watching the massive stranger with wide, frightened eyes. Chloe, the blind woman, called out again, her voice ringing with a desperate, uncharacteristic urgency that demanded absolute attention. "Bring the stranger inside, right now, my daughter. I need to hear his voice up close before my time runs out." "Teresa? I really do not think that is a good idea," Chloe argued, blocking the doorway with her body. But the blind woman pushed herself up onto her elbows with incredible effort. "Please, bring him to me," Teresa pleaded, and something in the raw desperation of the old woman's tone made Chloe reluctantly step aside, gesturing for the wealthy executive to enter the shack. Michael stepped over the threshold of a house that logic dictated should not exist, the packed dirt crunching loudly beneath his ruined Italian leather shoes. The orphans scrambled backward to clear a path for the towering stranger, watching him with massive, fearful eyes that had long ago learned to expect cruelty from outsiders. The heavy scent of burning firewood and cheap wax swallowed him completely, triggering another violent wave of impossible nostalgia, a powerful feeling that he had walked across this exact dirt floor in another lifetime. He slowly approached the rickety cot, dropping to his knees beside the bed, as Teresa turned her face toward him, searching his soul with eyes that could not see the physical world. "Come closer, my son," she whispered, extending a trembling, bony hand toward his face. "Let me hear you speak. Say absolutely anything to me right now." Michael cleared his throat nervously, feeling entirely out of his element as he crouched beside the dying woman, trying to maintain his composure. "My name is Michael Adams. I am the man who employs Chloe, and I am profoundly sorry for intruding on your home and for completely failing to understand her earlier today." Teresa froze her chest, rising and falling in shallow, erratic gasps. And then, very slowly, 2 heavy tears spilled over her eyelashes and navigated the deep wrinkles of her cheeks. That voice, she murmured, her tone dropping into a low, heart-wrenching sob. "It is deeper now, and so much sadder. But I know that exact voice I sang to it until it fell asleep 1,000 times. Ma'am, I assure you that you are making a mistake." Michael said, a cold shiver racing down his spine as he tried to pull his face away from her reaching hands. "You and I have never met before tonight. I grew up far away from here." "Lean closer to me," she insisted forcefully, reaching both her fragile hands out into the empty space. "Let me look at you with the only vision heaven left me." Overpowered by a force much stronger than his stubborn pride, Michael leaned forward, allowing her cold, thin fingers to gently trace the contours of his face with infinite, desperate care. Her thumbs brushed his forehead, mapped the sharp lines of his jaw, and suddenly stopped dead over a tiny faded scar located just above his left eyebrow. Teresa let out a choked, breathless sound that was equal parts a sob and a laugh, her fingers trembling over the small mark. "This scar," she whispered, her voice shattering into a million pieces, "you fell down the concrete steps out front. When you were just learning to walk, you scraped your knee and split your eyebrow open. I wiped away the blood using my very own apron, and I hummed your favorite song until you finally drifted to sleep, right here in my arms." Michael felt the dirt floor suddenly drop away beneath him, his entire reality unraveling in a single heartbeat, as the impossible truth struck him. "That is completely impossible." He stammered, his hands shaking violently as he stared at the blind woman. "How could you possibly know about that scar?" Teresa did not answer him with words. Instead, she began to hum a very soft, ancient lullaby, a simple, nameless melody without lyrics, just a fragile thread of sound floating through the candlelit room. And in that precise moment, something deep inside Michael Adams, buried beneath 40 years of money, arrogance, and forced amnesia, violently broke open. He knew that melody intimately. It had haunted his dreams his entire life, serving as an untraceable echo of comfort during the loneliest nights of his cold existence. And now the phantom song finally had a face, the face of a blind, impoverished old woman living in a dirt-floor shack at the edge of the world. He collapsed weeping for the mother he had forgotten, realizing that true wealth is never measured by the balances stored in our bank accounts, but rather by the enduring legacy of compassion we leave behind. When we strip away the illusions of success, luxury, and pride, we find that human connection, selfless giving, and an unwavering commitment to protecting the vulnerable are the only currencies that genuinely enrich the soul. The sacrifices we make for others without expecting applause echo eternally, reminding us that no matter how far we wander into the cold pursuit of material gain, the humble warmth of love will always guide us back to where we truly belong.